Of all the things that threaten interplanetary travel, this, in my opinion, is one of the worst. Our sun, or rather, the things that our sun generates. Yes, it fuels life on our planet, but it also presents a tremendous risk to anyone who would dare to travel from one planet to another, especially to Mars. On August 4th, 1972, one of the most powerful solar storms in human history was recorded, and it arrived at our planet at a frightening pace in a mere 14.6 hours. Fortunately, the astronauts from Apollo 16 had returned safely to Earth 4 months earlier, and the astronauts of Apollo 17 were not going to depart for another 4 months. However, if either crew had been at the moon or in the vicinity of the moon when this event had occurred, there would have been no escape. Even inside the relatively shielded command module, the astronauts would have suffered radiation sickness of varying degrees. If they had been unfortunate enough to be on the surface at the time, they would have been dealt a lethal dose of radiation. And this is the danger that faces any space mission in the future, and a significant reason why radiation protection needs to be a priority, especially for Starship. It's been estimated that a typical journey to Mars, a 6-month journey that is, would expose astronauts to approximately 30 REMs worth of radiation, or the equivalent of about 2 years and 4 months unprotected on the surface of Mars. Now, granted, this is not disastrous, but at the same time, the last thing that Martian colonists want to be doing is absorbing a ton of radiation before they even arrive at Mars, a place that tends to be a lot more radioactive than the place that they left. However, in the event of a full-fledged solar storm or coronal mass ejection, this would be nothing short of cataclysmic for our Martian travelers. And if it was a large group of starships taking advantage of a single launch window, you would be looking at hundreds or perhaps thousands of people receiving doses of radiation that would either make them very ill or perhaps even a lethal amount. And this is something we simply are not good enough at predicting, not 6 months in advance. That is still beyond the realm of our current science. Now, of course, just about every interplanetary design has some sort of solar storm shelter built into it, with some sort of very heavy duty materials or perhaps a great deal of water or something along those lines, protecting the colonists for a short period of time until the event was over. Although such events can last for days, but this is what protects our planet from such events: a very powerful magnetic field, something that Mars does not possess, at least not across the entire planet. But what if I were to tell you that we could take a magnetic field with us, something artificial, something portable, and something that wouldn't require a tremendous amount of power? Sound impossible? Well, I'm going to tell you all about a radiation shield within the capabilities of our current technology in just a few moments. Good evening, and welcome to yet another episode of The Angry Astronaut. Still in Colorado currently at my father's place, so minimalist as far as background is concerned and that sort of thing. But I'm going to be here for as long as is necessary, at least until Virgin Galactic appears to be going forward with their flight with Sir Richard Branson on board, assuming that that happens within the next week or so. If it gets delayed even further, I probably will be returning home, get back to my son, that sort of thing. As those of you who followed my channel for a long time know, that's really the number one thing that's of importance to me right now. As a matter of fact, I was going to cut my this trip short to go back and watch him compete in divisionals and swimming, but he insisted that I remain and continue doing what I do. So anyway, hats off to him. And enough of that. So for once, I am not going to be talking about Starship in any sort of gloom and doom or any sort of critical sort of way. Go back to the kind of conversations I used to have about Starship and, depart from the whole thing about going to orbit so quickly and all of that. I'm just going to let's assume that Starship gets to orbit on schedule, that there are no problems, no RUD on the pad, any of those sorts of consequences. Let's say everything goes exactly according to plan. Well, of course, there's a lot of other steps that need to be taken before Starship is going to be human rated. It's going to make unmanned journeys to Mars, that sort of thing. And of course, journeys to the moon as well seem to be in its future. But one of the greatest dangers, of course, that people talk about all the time when it comes to interplanetary journeys and indeed even journeys to the moon, especially if you're talking about long-term stays, is radiation and cosmic rays, the charged particles, gamma rays, and also intergalactic charged particles and cosmic rays that plague interplanetary space that we're protected from here on our planet for the most part by our magnetic field, something that Mars does not possess. And yet at the same time, its atmosphere at least provides a pretty substantial amount of protection, more than a lot of people give it credit for. But on a spaceship, you got nothing at all. Neither will you have anything on a moon base unless you go underground. The lunar gateway is going to have nothing. So what do you do about this? Well, there's all kinds of, material related solutions, but if you're talking about water, which is very good at absorbing radiation, or lead or any of those sorts of substances, all of those have a lot of mass associated with them. The more mass you have on a ship, the more difficult it is to accelerate it to the necessary velocities to reach the red planet in an acceptable amount of time in about 6 months. But there are those over the last 10 years or so who have been putting forth the idea of a radiation deflector shield, something straight out of science fiction, but it's more creating an artificial magnetic field. In other words, taking the magnetic field that we take for granted on our planet and transporting it with you on your ship, or rather on the Starship during its journey to Mars. And could this really be done? And if it could be done, how much power would it require? I mean, it seems almost impossible that something as mammoth as a magnetic field, something able to deflect solar radiation, could possibly be managed with the kind of technology and the kind of energy we have at our disposal today. Well, that's not the case. Not at all. It is very plausible with today's technology and indeed even today's solar power. How can this be done? Well, we're going to find out right now. There are a few misconceptions about solar storms and what makes them so damn dangerous. For one thing, it's just their unpredictability. Now, supposedly, the solar cycle is on an 11-year time period where it peaks at a predictable time, currently in 2025. However, if that were the case, the peak time for the Apollo era solar storm should have been 1970. And yet it happened in 1972 when things should have been on the downslope. Now, another misconception is the whole issue of gamma rays. Gamma radiation is actually not the most dangerous thing about a solar storm or solar radiation in general, but rather the high energy particles that it creates. The gamma ray radiation at the surface of the sun strips the hydrogen atoms of their electrons, creating high energy protons. The vast majority of the most dangerous stuff that's going to be heading at our astronauts is going to be comprised of high energy ionized protons and ionized helium, not gamma rays. So Elon was kind of right when he was minimizing the danger of radiation, at least gamma radiation. Stainless steel should provide a fairly decent protection against that, although I would prefer to see it lined with something a little bit better, perhaps a polyurethane multi-layered system as is used by the Sierra Nevada Corporation and was used by Bigelow Aerospace. However, the danger represented by these high-energy protons and high-energy helium ions is extremely different. This is a type of particle that can pierce through almost any kind of defense, very thick metal, or even water. And it's not just solar cosmic rays we need to worry about, it's also galactic cosmic radiation, the same sort of thing, but produced by different stars, including things like pulsars. These sorts of particles are very difficult to stop, and even if you can stop them, oftentimes they will interact with the material that is stopping them, creating new types of ions and new types of damaging particles. And this can be very bad news for somebody's DNA. We can only theorize as to the genetic and cellular damage that a human being would suffer from a full-fledged proton event from our sun, or even just the cosmic rays from going from planet to planet. Anything could happen, and of course the most obvious candidates for consequences are things like cancer and such, but also genetic defects, damage to internal organs, all sorts of unpleasant things. And so, as a result, we really need to find a way of stopping these things. And solar shelters are all well and good, but these things can last for quite some time. Imagine being crammed inside a very small shelter for 2 to 8 hours with dozens of people, and then during the recovery phase of the storm, that can go for as long as 7 days, and during that time, the cosmic ray danger still remains acute. Is this something that one would really want to take a risk for, especially when they're just trying to avoid the discomfort of a solar shelter? Well, as I've suggested, there's a better way. In a paper linked in the description that involves quite a number of scientists, including many from Oxford, they point out that there is a variety of drawbacks to using passive defense against cosmic rays, that is to say, any sort of materials, and rather they advocate an active defense, that is to say, an electromagnetic field. And the advantages to this is the fact that cosmic rays in themselves are ionized and therefore vulnerable to the effects of magnetic fields. So, if you generate an electromagnetic barrier of sorts around your ship, which takes a surprisingly small amount of energy, you can deflect the particles long before they arrive at the ship. But wait a minute, these particles are traveling at hundreds or sometimes thousands of kilometers per second. How the hell are you supposed to deflect something moving that quickly without using a ton of energy? Well, as a matter of fact, one of the advantages that we have with cosmic rays is also one of the things that make them so difficult to stop. There are very few of them for every cubic centimeter. 10, as a matter of fact, on average, would fit on the end of the average human thumb. And since there's so few of them, even the densest material has a hard time stopping them. But an electromagnetic field, even a weak one, would serve to deflect the most powerful solar storm. We're talking kilowatts here, not megawatts. Now, the following is a diagram of how this system worked in a laboratory and how it might work protecting a spacecraft. Remember, the advantage of this system is number one, it uses the electromagnetic qualities of the ions themselves against them. And number two, you don't have to stop them. All you have to do is deflect them at a considerable enough distance to where they miss the spacecraft or the so called safe zone. And as a result, with only 16 kilowatts worth of energy, this was sufficient to deflect 100,000 times the typical energy of the solar wind. 100,000 times, and it deflected all of the incoming particles. Now, granted, this is inside a laboratory. This has never been tested in space for some reason, and it needs to be. Now, I'm sure all of you have heard about the new solar arrays that are being deployed on the ISS. Each one of these will generate more than 20 kilowatts worth of electricity, eventually totaling 120 kilowatts worth of energy. And they're highly compact and don't weigh much either, so something like this would be very easy to take along and deploy on the Starship before making your journey to Mars. And it would quite easily power the magnetic field that we're talking about, one actually that could be substantially more powerful and could reach out hundreds of kilometers out into space. And I have a second paper linked in the description that covers that particular scenario. That type of shield would require about 100 kilowatts worth of energy, still only slightly more than what the ISS currently generates, and that's without the new solar arrays, and certainly a lot less than what's going to be needed for Starship. Indeed, the power requirements of such a shield are going to be substantially less than the power requirements for life support and other critical systems on Starship, all of which may require a massive solar array or nuclear power. But the advantages of such a system are many-fold. Instead of having to weigh your ship down with a lot of material to try to stop these energized particles, you can instead prevent them from arriving at the ship at all. And even the best solar storm shelter is not going to stop all of the incoming particles, whereas this system could. As a matter of fact, even tested to 1,000,000 times the intensity of the typical solar wind, the system stopped 95% of the incoming particles, better than any material possibly could. And oh yeah, these high-energy particles can also wreak havoc with the ship's electrical systems and computers. As a matter of fact, the 1972 event detonated magnetic mines off the coast of Vietnam, and that was through our magnetic field. So something like this, a shield with this kind of potential, has many, many uses to ensure not only the health, but also the safety of the Starship as it makes a 6-month journey. And we must not fool ourselves into thinking that these sorts of storms are rare occurrences and are only going to represent a problem occasionally. There is a 20% chance that any ship on a 6-month journey is going to encounter a highly energized solar particle event, or SEP. That is not an inconsiderable chance. Now, there is a drawback to this system. Any sort of electromagnetic field being impacted by high-energy protons is actually going to drive whatever is generating the field off course ever so slightly, and any sort of deviation from the Starship's trajectory could be cataclysmic, but there's a solution for that as well. In a paper entitled Radiation Shielding Produced by Mini Magnetospheres by the Department of Earth and Space Sciences at the University of Washington, they suggest a pulsed kind of magnetic shield. That is to say, a system that sends out pulses of electromagnetic radiation so there isn't a direct interaction between the magnetic field and the spacecraft itself. So these pulses will drive away the high energy particles without affecting the ship. And so here it is, a concept for an interplanetary spacecraft completely protected by an artificial magnetic field. And as you can see, the solar arrays don't have to produce a great deal of power in order to accomplish this. As I said before, the bigger challenges are going to be the power needed for life support and other considerations. So, really, why have we not done this yet? I mean, it seems to work pretty well in a lab, and we've actually seen it work in nature with many magnetospheres that naturally appear on the moon, sometimes called lunar wisps. And more information on this can be found in the papers that I have linked in the description. But still, why has this not been done on a grander scale? Well, I'm afraid I can't answer that question, aside from just a lack of belief on the part of the scientific community that it can work. I mean, some have suggested that we use a much larger scale of something like this to create a magnetosphere for Mars so that we can terraform it. Another concept that is not easily accepted by the scientific community. So, is it just simple narrow mindedness? Well, if this is indeed the case, then NASA had better get over it pretty quickly, because astronauts are going to be on the Lunar Gateway in less than half a decade, probably, and the materials on this station may not be enough to protect them from a full fledged solar storm. And if these astronauts are dealt a lethal dose of radiation, that could stop Artemis in its tracks. It could stop Elon's ambitions of going to Mars in its tracks. This is a risk that we dare not take, especially given that this idea of a deflector shield for solar radiation has been around for so long and yet has not been tested in space. In my opinion, that is simply unforgivable. So, as is usually the case with these episodes, I'm going to get a little pissed off about something. This is a very intriguing technology that we've gone over in this episode. Very intriguing in terms of what's coming up for the human species and for our astronauts in the very near future. Because we're not just talking about interplanetary travel here, we're talking about going to the moon. Those astronauts on the Lunar Gateway and their mission duration is expected to be about 30 days or so. And as you saw in the course of the video, one of the Apollo missions, if it had gone at a different time, probably could not have made it back before a major solar storm would have ended the lives of all three of those astronauts. It was just pure dumb luck that saved their lives. And in this case, on the Lunar Gateway, we're going to be looking at astronauts spending a whole month subject to the fury of our star that fuels life on this planet, but is incredibly hostile to life beyond the protective shield of our magnetic field. We need to do something about this, and we need to do something about this now. And I would prefer to see it done on some probe that we send out, some interplanetary probe scheduled for departure in the future. Do some sort of proof of concept solar deflection system or radiation deflection system, whatever you want to call it, that we've been talking about in this episode. Some sort of proof of concept to see how well it works. Because just because it works in a lab doesn't mean that it's going to work in practice. And I would far prefer to see it work under those sorts of circumstances rather than subject living astronauts as human guinea pigs, which they are likely to be if we don't take radical action to protect them here in the future. Now, I'm sure NASA has their share of plans, but they may have only plans to deal with day to day cosmic radiation, day to day solar radiation. What about the times when they're going to be exposed to solar storms? Do they have a solid plan for that? Well, if they don't, then they better explore things like the technology that we have discussed in this episode, or something else very soon, because we've got a scant few years before those astronauts are going to be on the lunar gateway. Plus, if Elon gets his way, there's going to be settlers on their way to Mars in a very short amount of time as well. And material protection may not be enough. It may take some thinking outside the box, as I often like to say on this channel, for us to come up with a solution to provide comprehensive protection to the dangers that exist in interplanetary space. If you like what I talk about on this channel, if you like the subjects that I bring up, and it interests you and you want to see more of it in the future, well, you know how to support me. It's all in the description, a wide variety of ways to support me. And also, I'd like to say again, there are quite a number of my supporters who recently stood up to in my time of need here during this trip, and boy, made a huge difference to this channel. Thank you so much. And also look in the description for a link for a very interesting video from Spaceship Mania on how he made the alpaca lander that's sitting back in my studio in South Carolina that I'm eager to get back to. So until we have this comprehensive defense against the dangers of interplanetary travel, the dangers of interplanetary radiation and cosmic rays, until we can say with certainty that our astronauts and our future settlers of the red planet are going to be safe from the fury of our sun, I urge all of you to stay angry about space.